I went to Catholic school my whole life, but after reading this book, Case for Christ by Lee Strobel, the factual evidence that he existed is kind of overwhelming.
I'd like to see that because the factual evidence that he existed has always been underwhelming.
I'm here joined by the great, the powerful. It's Michael Jones. How are you doing today?
Doing good. Thanks for having me.
It really is awesome to have you on the channel, man. I've watched your stuff for a long time, and I think the work that you do is great. And I think it's going to come into play today in an important way as we are going to look at a few different videos featuring Bill Maher, who I have to say, by way of intro, is interestingly, I wouldn't really say an intellectual, but has been so influential in terms of shaping the way that people thought about religion. First through that documentary, Religulous, and then now he's got his podcast going. He's had a huge cultural influence, even though not in any type of academic sense, but just I think it's his tone, his comedy, his way of communicating that people found to be fairly persuasive. But as we're going to get to in this video, there's a few things that were in Religulous that are themselves quite ridiculous. So we're going to get into that, but let's first play this more recent video here with Bill Maher and Destephano, which I thought was just an interesting conversation. It's rare that you see, Case for Christ and Lee Strobel and things brought up in this way in pop culture. So I thought it was a really cool moment, and also something that we could kind of comment on, tackle, together, and kind of round out the conversation that they're having there. So
I believe in Jesus, by the way. We'll talk about that.
Oh.
I'm reading Case for Christ by Lee Strobel. It's convincing evidence.
What do you think? I throw people out of the club here? We believe in whatever you want.
I didn't. I went to Catholic school my whole life, but after reading this book, Case for Christ by Lee Strobel, the factual evidence that he existed is kind of overwhelming.
I'd like to see that because the factual evidence that he existed has always been underwhelming. In fact, it's always...
Read Case for Christ.
Yeah, I
Give
will.
it a shot by Lee Strobel.
This is based on what? Archaeological finds?
Archaeological finds.
New ones?
Theological finds. Ivy League.
What are theological finds?
Bill, ready for this?
Yeah.
All right, I'll stop it right there when he's talking about theological finds. So there's a lot I don't like in this conversation. It just really seems like there's two guys who just are not well informed on this, trying to have a conversation. For one, the evidence that Jesus existed is not underwhelming. 99% of historians are going to say it's just an historical fact that there was a guy named Jesus. He existed and he died by crucifixion. John Dominic Crossan, for example, who's not a friend to conservative Christians, says it's as sure as anything historical could ever be. Gerd Ludemann, who's an atheist, says it's indisputable that Jesus died by crucifixion. So he obviously had to exist to die by crucifixion. And this other guy, I forget his name. His name is Chris, I believe. Destephano.
Yeah, Chris. Yep.
I would like to know what he means by archaeological finds or theological finds. We don't have what I would classify as archaeological evidence for Jesus. But that's not a problem because we don't have archaeological evidence for most people that have ever existed. Like, we don't have archaeological evidence that most of the Jews that lived in Judea at that time existed. That's just not what's going to happen. Like John the Baptist, Theudas, Judas the Galilean, James, the brother of Jesus, these folk, we don't have archaeological evidence for most people that have existed. And theological finds, I don't know what he means by that. That doesn't make sense. Well, what evidence we have for Jesus existed is textual evidence. He's mentioned by Tacitus, Josephus in two places. He's mentioned by Mahr bar Serapion. He's mentioned by Lucian, Celsus. He's probably mentioned by Suetonius. And then, of course, he's mentioned in our earliest source of Christian writings, which is Paul. Paul talks about him as an historical person in multiple places. For example, he says in Galatians 4 that Jesus was born of a woman. He says in Romans 1 he was a descendant of David. In Galatians 1:19, he had a brother named James. In 2 Corinthians 13, he says he was crucified. In 2 Corinthians 15, he says he died, was buried, and then rose. 1 Corinthians 11, Paul says that he had, on the night he was betrayed, he had the Lord's Supper. So we have all these historical facts. Paul is clearly talking about a real historical person. And so with all this evidence, we've got overwhelming evidence that a real historical person named Jesus existed.
Can I just kind of highlight that it seems to me that what you've done there that I think is very compelling is you've given us sort of like external and then internal evidence as well, meaning like outside of scripture and then inside of scripture. And I think that's important because I think a lot of people try to portray it as if what we're saying is, so the Bible told me so, right? It's just the Bible said it, therefore it's true. But really what you're talking about is, I think what Chris Destephano was trying to get at here, which is that there's historic evidence in the same sense that we are looking at, any type of historic evidence. So I think that that's a great point that you've made up there. I have one other thing I want to say, actually, that I want to ask you about on this note is, and tell me if I'm missing something here, but it seems to me that there's this funny magic trick that takes place where as soon as a source in history goes from not believing in Jesus, not believing in the resurrection, to believing in Jesus and testifying about the resurrection, they also go from being a credible to an incredible source. I think in particular of like the Apostle Paul. This is someone who he wasn't raised this way, right? In fact, none of the people that believe in the resurrection grew up believing in the resurrection. But there's this funny thing that I feel like happens academically, where as soon as you attest to these things, it's like you're then biased, and that's no longer valid history, and it should all be discarded. And I just think there's something about that feels like putting the cart before the horse.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's a good point. It does seem that way. I don't think it's intentional, but I do think there's a lot of anti-Christian bias in academia, and this has been documented by researchers like George Yancey, for example, who've actually done research showing that this does exist in academia. But we do see that problem, and I've also had non-Christians be like, well, I want a non-Christian source that says the resurrection happened. That would be an oxymoron, because if someone believes in the resurrection in the ancient world, they would be a professing Christian. Like that's not how this works. If you believe Jesus rose from the dead, you're a Christian, and if not, you're a non-Christian. So you're not going to have non-Christian sources confirming the truth of Christianity. So they're asking for something that doesn't exist. And there's nothing wrong with using the Bible. When people say you're just going off the Bible, well, no, the Bible's not one source. It's a collection of various sources. And for the New Testament, we have multiple witnesses talking about what the early Christians believed and what Jesus taught. And we'll get into this later in the video, but we have a lot of good evidence from this canon we call the New Testament for Jesus existing and many of the things that he did throughout his life.
All right, what else you got for us, Mr. Mahr? Come at us.
If I told you, okay, if I told you factual evidence about Alexander the Great, you would believe me.
Okay, but even still, it's a silly point, because who cares if Jesus lived? It's whether he's then died and was reborn and is up in heaven with his Father, who's really him.
Okay,
that's the part where the rubber meets the road. Maybe he existed. I agree. That's
fine.
Absolutely possible. Fine. He may have existed.
But according to Case for Christ, independent sources who didn't know each other, who wrote about him within 20 years of his death, talked about these miracles happening as in real time.
Okay, well, again,
and Alexander the Great's biographers, the earliest one was like 100 years after he died.
Real quick, I just want to correct Chris. The earliest biographies of Alexander the Great, I believe it's Diodorus. That's close to 300 years after he existed. I don't think we have any surviving copies of people writing a biography about Alexander until about 300 years after he existed. One of the famous ones is Arrian, Diodorus, Plutarch as well, and there's another one, but I can't remember. But yeah, it's not 100 years, it's much further off.
Chris, I'm going to have to burst your bubble now, because here's I have to spit a couple of facts at you that are kind of going to okay.
It's Hollywood.
There's only two sources in the Bible. Okay. There's the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
Okay. There's also another guy, Josephus, who wasn't accepted, but read the Case for Christ.
Not in the Bible.
Okay, real quick. I have no idea what Chris means by Josephus. I think he's trying to say Josephus, and Josephus wasn't rejected from the Bible. Josephus is a Jewish historian who's writing around like 90 AD. He would never have been considered canon or a Christian source if that's who he's referring to. But there's no one in history named Josephus. So I don't know who Chris is referring to. I think he's trying to say Josephus here.
I think so.
Something's getting really muddy. But Josephus was writing after most of the New Testament was complete. I think the only document that postdates Josephus would be maybe the Gospel of John, or it's a contemporary of when Josephus was writing.
Okay.
But the Bible is itself an anthology. They found some few decades ago the Dead Sea Scrolls,
Right.
which
Found 'em
were
out.
other books that were just basically edited out. So right away we know a person decided what constituted the Bible, and just some stuff wound up on the cutting room floor.
All right, let's respond to Bill here on the canonization of the Bible. He says first there's only two sources for the New Testament. That's just nonsense. You got Paul, you've got the Epistle of James, you got Peter, you've got Jude. Okay, then you've got the four Gospels. Now it's very clear when you get to the four Gospels, Matthew and Luke use Mark as a source, but Luke has got independent information he's drawing from. Matthew's got independent information he's drawing from. Now, some think they're using another source called Q. But even if you include that, they still have independent stuff. So Matthew's got independent information. Luke's got independent information. They have Q and Mark. And then John is, I would say he's aware of the other Gospels. Paul Anderson wrote a really good book on John, noting that John is aware of the other Gospels, but he's not dependent on them, especially literary dependence. So he's sort of his own source as well. So when you look at just the four canonical Gospels, if you're going to take the traditional understanding you might get from someone like Ehrman, you have Mark, you have Q, you have Matthew's independent sources, Luke independent sources, and then you got John. So that's like five. Then you got Paul, then you got Peter, then you got Jude, then you got James. Some think Revelation was written by another John, so that'd be another source as well. So, and then you got the author of the book of Hebrews as well. So what, we're over like 10 sources here at this point? So it's not two. That's ridiculous. Furthermore, if you read Paul's letters, and I think this is an important point. So if you go to like 1 Thessalonians 1:1, and people sort of skip over this. It says, Paul, Silas, and Timothy to the church of the Thessalonians. Okay, that's three. That's Paul, Silas, and Timothy. We see the same thing when we read 1 Corinthians 1. We see this in other places in Paul's letters where he's using other authors. So in reality, we've got multiple sources here, multiple people contributing to these epistles and these documents as well. It's not just this really simplified version that it's just two sources. That's absurd. Second, let's talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls. Okay, those weren't ever so we found a whole collection in the Dead Sea Scrolls. We found some biblical texts, pseudepigrapha, texts that were just for the community. It's not like they found a bunch of texts that were just sort of left out of the Bible. Not all texts in the ancient world would be considered scripture. So we know from the writings of Josephus that basically the books that line up with the Tanakh, so that's the Jewish word for the Hebrew that we call the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible. Basically, his collection aligns with what basically Protestants have. And then Catholics include some Apocrypha writings as well, Catholics and Orthodox. But what we found in the Dead Sea Scrolls is just additional pseudepigrapha works, community documents. It's not that we have evidence they were ever included as part of the canon. So some people bring up the Book of Enoch, which is included in the Ethiopian canon. We have no evidence the Jews of the first century ever considered Enoch to be scripture, and then it was like taken out later. They just had other writings. Not everything they wrote was necessarily considered scripture. So there's just a lot of problems with what Mahr is saying here, just in multiple ways.
Yeah, I think that it's interesting because he just says that to a large audience. It doesn't really get checked in any way. And I'm sure a ton of people walk away believing that it's true. And this is kind of a theme that we're going to see even as we get into the second video here, just saying things that are actually factually incorrect, but saying them with swagger, saying them with confidence. And then they end up in the comments of my YouTube section of my YouTube videos. So I like that you're holding his feet to the fire here and actually adding a bit more historical nuance. Is there anything else on this point, or should we continue?
No, let's continue on now.
Okay.
Get it. Council of Nicaea. I get it.
Council of Nicaea, yes.
325 AD.
Yes.
That's when they decided the Christian religion. I agree with you.
Right.
Okay, let's just stop there. They're both wrong. Okay, Council of Nicaea. No, this is a stupid conspiracy that still goes around. The Council of Nicaea did not discuss the biblical canon. They did not. That did not come up. The Council of Nicaea was called by Constantine because in the Christian world within the empire, the Christians, the Orthodox Christians, were fighting with this new group called the Arians. Arius comes out of Alexandria. He gets kicked out for heresy. He goes to Antioch and his heresy spreads. He believed Jesus was a created being. So he would teach that Jesus was a separate substance from the Father. The Orthodox position that we see in church fathers earlier than this, like Justin Martyr, Tertullian, Irenaeus, they taught Jesus was of the same substance with the Father. Justin Martyr said in the 2nd century that Jesus is basically fire kindled from fire, but not from abscission of the same substance, basically. Paraphrasing a little bit there, but you get the idea. So that was the belief of the church. You get to later on, so the beginning of the 4th century, the Arians start popping up. The council is called to deal with this. They bring in bishops from all over the place, around 300, I believe. They take a vote. Most, I believe, around 19 or so, roughly, agreed with Arius. So you're talking about overwhelming majority agreeing with the Orthodox position. It's then threatened that whoever doesn't agree with this, they're going to be exiled. I think all but like 2 or 3, along with Arius, voted in favor of the Orthodox position. So that's why the council was called. They discussed some other things like administrative issues. This is where they discussed the date of Easter. That's where it comes from. That's why we celebrate Easter now on the first Sunday after the first full moon of the spring equinox. They wanted a standardized way to celebrate Easter for the whole Christian world. They came up with it there. Nothing about the biblical canon came up at Nicaea. This was about the Arian heresy. It is a modern day myth. I believe it goes back to writers like Voltaire, possibly some earlier medieval writers. But the idea the Council of Nicaea decided what Christianity was or came up with the biblical canon, utter nonsense that's just laughable to academic historians.
And yeah, I can't, to your point, I can't even really see any reason why that myth would have developed. It doesn't seem like it really achieves anything one way or the other. It's just basically misinformation that I guess is in the culture. Do you have any, I mean, is there any reason that you can think of how this myth arose?
Yeah.
Is it okay?
Oh, I can think. I can't remember. It's hard for me to remember how to exactly trace it. I know Voltaire pushes it around, but I think he got it from someone earlier. The reason that the myth about the Council of Nicaea comes about is because this is the first council in a period when the emperor is Christian, when Christianity is basically legalized, and they're starting to get more power. So now they've got some power. How are they going to use it? Well, they call this council. Surely they must be using that power inappropriately or corrupting things, because that's just what people tend to think. That's where minds tend to go. But there's no evidence of that. We got to remember, a lot of these bishops that were at the Council of Nicaea lived through the Diocletian persecution. So an earlier Roman emperor from about 20 years prior to this really persecuted the Christians. I mean, really, like tortured people to death, mutilated them. They persevered through this period. And you're going to tell me just a few years later, they're willing to just change everything they were willing to die for a few decades earlier? Utter nonsense. It didn't happen this way.
That's really interesting. Thank you for sharing that. That rounds it out nicely.
Awesome. All right, let's keep going.
Yep.
I'm with you on that.
I remember that.
But I'm telling you, read this book.
That's Emperor Constantine.
Shout out Constantine, Turkey, all that.
Well, the first one.
Constantinople.
The first one to change the Roman Empire to a Christian empire.
They decided all the holidays.
Took 3 centuries.
I get it. And listen, Bill,
But-
I'm with you on that.
But here's the important point.
Let's do it.
There's only these 5 sources.
A little bit more tequila, that's it.
Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
I'm wrecked right now.
Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
Good boys.
Not contemporaries of Jesus, not even close. Matthew,
Okay.
So they lived from 70 to 110 years after him.
I understand.
No, from 40 to 70 years after.
But they got their information from Josephus, who lived about 10 years after Jesus.
Okay, let's stop here. Okay. Whatever Chris said about Josephus, that's just utter nonsense. Sorry, Chris. You think you mean Josephus, and Josephus was writing after the 3 synoptic gospels were complete and already circulating. That's just a fact. Bill said they lived 40 to 70 years after Jesus, the gospel authors. Okay, I get what he's trying to say. He's not wording it right. The argument is they wrote 40 to 70 years. It's not like Matthew was born or Mark was born 40 years after Jesus, and then he wrote when he was like 15. That's just nonsense. The argument is that Mark was completed around 70 AD, then Matthew, and then Luke around like 80 to 85 AD, then John around 90 AD. That's generally where the standard is for dating them. But that means, like, I mean, like, these would be full-grown adults. They would have lived during a time period when eyewitnesses lived. Now, here's an important point about this. We have no evidence in the ancient world of fictional biographies being written within the lifetime of the eyewitnesses of the person. So we have fictional biographies about people, but they're written like 100 years after the person supposedly existed, like Apollonius of Tyana. Philostratus wrote that. So fictional biographies, but they're written long after all the eyewitnesses would have died out. The Gospels are written within the lifetime of the eyewitnesses of Jesus. This is what Craig Keener talks about in his book, Christobiography. Richard Bauckham's book, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, is another good book on that. So if you're writing within the lifetime, you can't make stuff up, basically, is what I'm trying to say. You're writing to try to get accurate historical information. You're consulting eyewitnesses on this stuff. Another important point. The idea these people were written long after that, it's, again, most scholars will take that, that these aren't eyewitness accounts. I would push back on that. I'm going through a series right now on my channel arguing that the Gospels are eyewitness accounts or based on eyewitness accounts. So I think Matthew was written by the disciple Matthew. The disciple John wrote John. Mark was written by the interpreter of Peter, named Mark. And Luke was a traveling companion of Paul who would have interviewed witnesses. Let's set aside Matthew and John for now. I'll have more videos on that this summer to cover that. But let's look at Mark. Maurice Casey, who's an atheist and a scholar, wrote a book a while ago called Aramaic Sources for the Gospel of Mark. And in there, he argued that Mark would be getting his information from some Aramaic speaker, specifically one of the 12. The internal data of Mark suggested he was getting his information from some Aramaic-speaking Jew, who probably would have been a member of the 12. Now that matches the church tradition we see that later church fathers talk about, that Mark was getting his information from Peter. There's a lot of good internal evidence to support that too. James Crossley adds to Maurice Casey's case, and he tries to argue that Mark even dates to around the 40s. So he tries to place Mark very early and says that this information, again, came from some early Aramaic sources, which I find interesting. Recently, another scholar named Luke Vandeweghe wrote a book called Living Footnotes on the Gospel of Luke, and he discusses something called onomastic congruence. That sounds like a very complicated term. What it basically refers to is naming patterns. So we know from lexical research, the most popular names in Judea in the first century, the least popular names. We've got a whole database on this. If you were going to make up a fictional account, okay, your naming pattern is going to be very hard to mimic what was actually on the ground. So we know the most popular name in Judea in the first century was Simon, then Joseph. Therefore, if you're going to write a document like that, the most popular name showing up in your document should be Simon, Joseph. Names like Nicodemus, Zacchaeus, Ananias should come up much less because those are much rarer names. What do we find? Well, Luke Vandeweghe did a whole analysis on this, and he found quite interestingly that the Gospel's onomastic congruence, the Gospel's naming pattern, fits really well with the naming patterns of the first century. He did the same thing with Apocrypha Gospels. They don't have that. They lack onomastic congruence, which we would expect because they're fictional. If the Gospels were more like the fictional Apocrypha Gospels, that's the naming pattern they should match. They don't. They fit more with the naming pattern we find in Josephus's own autobiography, which also has onomastic congruence. So it seems very much that whoever was writing these Gospels was getting their information from eyewitnesses. They're getting actual stories from people who interacted with Jesus. And that's why they get the right names. They get the right naming pattern because Jesus had to interact with people. They had names. And so they're recording these names. It's very, very hard for fictional writers or forgers to get the naming pattern you have in the Gospels. It's far more likely this came from actual people that were interviewing eyewitnesses or eyewitnesses themselves.
And is the significance of everything that you just laid out there basically that there is an attempt that has been made or is still being made to basically unhitch the gospel, each gospel account from its connection to eyewitness investigation in order to basically kind of discredit the veracity of the text or what, like, can you give us just a little bit of context about why what you just laid out is significant in terms of in terms of the idea that these were people either themselves eyewitnesses or people talking to direct eyewitnesses. It sounds like that's what you're kind of making a case for. But I'm just, for those who don't know, what's kind of the debate that has gone on and why does it matter, I guess is what I'm asking.
Well, the debate is that the Gospels were not written by the men they're attributed to. They were written much later and by people who didn't know the eyewitnesses of Jesus. They're just sort of hearing stories from handed down to them. And I'm arguing that's not likely. I'm arguing it's far more likely that Mark and Luke were not eyewitnesses, but interviewed eyewitnesses or worked with them. And Matthew and John were eyewitnesses. So these are people that got accurate information on Jesus. The Gospels are handing down accurate and important information on who Jesus is and what he taught.
And you're saying the point about it being early is also not important just for the eyewitness connection that you just laid out, but also that it's really easy to get called out for making up lies if the people who witnessed it themselves are still alive to say, that didn't happen, I was there, bro, basically.
Yeah, and we see other historians doing that, like Thucydides calling out people. Josephus calls out other people for writing histories that he just thought were inaccurate. In fact, Josephus says his main opponent is we can't trust him because he waited till like eyewitnesses had died before he started writing, whereas Josephus was an eyewitness, and therefore he's far more trustworthy. We don't see that with the Christian sources or the Gospels, and we know they had Christian opponents like Celsus, for example, who was trying to debunk Christianity, Lucian as well. But we don't see that charge really being brought up like it should be, like with what the way Josephus words the way he does.
Yeah, that's a great point. And also I'm thinking of little clues that I'm sure you know a lot more about than I do, but even in the Jewish Talmud, right? Or is it the Babylonian Talmud, where they refer to Jesus as a worker of black magic or a miracle worker, and they apply a negative light to it. But when I read that, I'm like, that's interesting that he's being accused of working. I think the language they use is like dark magic or black magic. And to me, that's one of those interesting implicit admissions to the miraculous activity.
Yeah, that's in the Babylonian Talmud. So yeah, we do see that. And so it does seem, and a lot of scholars do believe Jesus was believed to be a miracle worker. They do believe like basic facts about him, like that he died, was crucified, that his followers reported that he had risen from the dead, and that he was a miracle worker who predicted his own death. So these are pretty common facts that people tend to believe about the historical Jesus.
It's good stuff. What does Bill have anything else in here that we want to hit, or I forget exactly where this conversation goes?
I think he needs a little bit more. Let me play a little bit more and we'll see.
Okay.
So already we're into a game of telephone. Okay.
Bill, yes, but
the other person,
I want to make you let your point, but let me just quickly. The game of telephone, yes, I agree with you that point. But the game of telephone in Jesus' times, according to Lee Strobel in the case of Christ, was the simple fact of we're playing the game of telephone. There's 10 people here. The game of telephone, as we know it today, is you say something in my ear and then it goes around 10 times. And by the time it gets to you, it's something radically different. This game of telephone, this ancient game of telephone was, but you tell it to me, then the third guy confirms what you said before it goes to the fourth guy. So there's a level of checking, checks and balances.
Chris, you're working too hard. If you want to believe this shit, believe it. You don't have to convince me or
I'm just convincing you of case for Christ.
Or construct this scaffolding to which you hang this belief. Just believe it. It's all good.
Okay.
But it's
Don't come to me, and when you die at St. Peter's, I'm not getting you in.
But you know, I can't go there with you. It's just, you know, it's silly. And
well, I'm just saying, it's nice the idea to believe in something. I'm just trying it on for size.
Here's also what's very interesting, and then I'll leave this subject. Excuse me. I think I've bored the audience with this before, but
What do you think Barbara in Milwaukee gives a fuck? They turned this off. When they turned this off when they found out I wasn't Ellen.
yeah, like that's the kind of audience we have.
Your audience is great.
So
you think they'll like me?
St. Paul,
Good guy, St. Paul, aka Saul, and the capital of Minnesota.
is the other source of the Bible.
Yes.
There's Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. I said the two names out of order because that's the order in the Bible. The first gospel, Mark, is 70 AD. Jesus dies in 33. So that's 40 years almost after he died.
Okay.
So not contemporaries. Paul comes before the gospel writers. He's writing around the year 50. in the 50s.
Okay.
So he's much closer to Jesus's time. So you'd think he would know more about Jesus than the people who came later, but actually St. Paul knows almost nothing about Jesus. He barely conceives of him as something that, as a person who lived on earth. There's no details about his life like they are in the Gospels.
All right, well, Bill is just wrong here about the details in Paul. I mean, as I mentioned earlier, Paul mentions numerous historical facts, like he was born of a woman, descended from David, had a brother named James, he was crucified and buried and rose, and people saw this, that he had a Lord's Supper, that he was betrayed. Jewish authorities were involved in killing him, like in 1 Thessalonians 2. And Jesus died at the hands of earthly rulers, like in 1 Corinthians 2, 1 Corinthians 2:8, I believe it is. So we have a lot of historical facts. And then Seon Kim and the Dictionary of Paul's Letters actually goes through numerous times where it seems as though Paul is quoting an early gospel tradition. So he's confirming a lot of the same teachings that Jesus laid out. And if you want to see more, see a video I did on my channel called The Hidden Gospel. And basically it's the argument that the gospel is in Paul's letters. We've just missed it because it's not like he's quoting from a text, he's quoting from the oral tradition. So he constantly is getting a lot of facts about Jesus right and passing on important teachings that he got from the oral tradition about Jesus. The idea of Mark dates to 70 AD is based on this idea that in Gospel of Mark, Jesus predicts the destruction of the temple, which happened in 70 AD. Since Jesus could not make a prediction like that, therefore, it's probably something that dates to that time. The problem is a lot of scholars today think Jesus really did predict the destruction of the temple. Jesus says things about it that are not really aligning exactly with the destruction of the temple. Like at one point, Jesus says prayer doesn't happen in winter, but that'd be ridiculous to include because it happened in the summer is when Jerusalem was conquered. So you don't need to include something like that. Jesus also uses hyperbole to say every stone will be removed from the place, and that's not also what happened. So, I mean, like if you're going to make something up, you're not going to put something in Jesus's mouth that could be misconstrued. Also, the way Jesus talks about it, he's basically he's describing the destruction of the temple and the way it's described in Daniel, which tells us that he's not drawing on the historical destruction of the temple. He's drawing on the prophecies we see in Daniel. And that also shows us people just predicted the destruction of the temple, like the author of Daniel, long before Jesus did. So obviously you could predict the destruction of the temple because it already happened once. It was destroyed. Solomon's temple was destroyed. So why couldn't it happen again? And there's a lot of good evidence that Mark probably dates to around 60 AD, and then Luke and Acts date around that time as well. I don't see any good evidence to really put the Synoptic Gospels past 70 AD. I think they're pre-70 AD.
That's super interesting. And kind of going back for a second to what you were saying about Paul too, you're causing me to think about a recent video that we did on this channel where we were looking at Bart Ehrman talking about what he calls the, I think, developmental view, sort of this idea that the divinity claims emerged over time as you go from Mark into, and by the time you get to John, then you have all the claims of divinity. But going to your point about Paul, who is supposed to be earlier, his writings are full of divine claims. As far as I read them, he has an extremely high view of Christ. And so I think that that's interesting for that point as well. It's not like he's just talking, he is talking history to your point, but he's not just talking about a dude named Jesus, etc. He has a super high view of who Jesus was, as far as I read it.
Absolutely. And I believe it's in Romans 10. He says, whoever calls upon the name of the Lord will be saved. Now he's quoting Joel 2:32, which is about Yahweh. And he says, actually, when you say that, it's about Jesus. He's identifying Jesus as Yahweh.
Yep. That's great stuff, man. Is there anything else in this video that we want to cover? Did we talk about the telephone game idea that they were going into there a little bit? I think that that's something I kind of hear a lot. I guess you kind of addressed that when you were talking about that the sources are early and they're talking to eyewitnesses. I guess that kind of closes the loop on the idea of telephone. But is there anything else that we should say on that, or is that basically the gist of it?
No, I think we can move on to the next video if you want.
Okay, great. Well, this has been awesome. I think it's good to do this type of stuff because a lot of people just watch this original video and they just think, I guess, Chris is doing the best job of representing the Christian view. Bill's kind of coming in with this attack, and you're kind of left not super convinced. Although I thought it was cool. I like seeing, comics and pop culture people reading Lee Strobel. I think that's really cool. but I
Yeah.
definitely just read that. I'm like, man, there's a need to chop this up a bit with the great Mike Jones. So I appreciate your time and your help.
Oh yeah, yeah, glad to do it. I mean, Chris is doing the best he can, but I mean, again, he's getting a lot of things wrong, unfortunately.